The world is experiencing some of its most extreme weather patterns on record, from floods and intense rains to heat waves. And greenhouse gases from human activity like burning fossil fuels and generating electricity are contributing significantly to these hazards. Now, Africa has been responsible for less than 4% of the emissions, but it is by far the most vulnerable region to the effects of climate change. Now, among these, experts predict that most parts of the continent will experience much drier conditions. That's already the case in parts of northern Kenya, which have not seen rain for more than a year. DW's correspondent Mariel Müller reports.
These mothers have walked for hours to reach this health facility. They want to have their babies checked.
Some of these babies are severely malnourished, and their mothers who are breastfeeding them haven't been able to eat properly in weeks. Now they're being registered here at this health facility, and they hope to receive nutrition supplements.
One of them is Adikeno. His upper arm circumference shows that he is severely malnourished. His mother has only eaten maize meal for weeks now, so her breast milk doesn't have enough nutrients for her baby.
It gives me great pain. My baby is 2.5 years old and he's too weak to stand up.
Health worker Gracie Lamo has seen a stream of undernourished children here in the past months. And there are many other children who remain without help out there.
Due to distance, not all malnourished children come here. Because of the distance, we can't reach out to all of them. It really makes me feel bad.
Nearly 1 in 5 young children in Marsabit County are considered malnourished. Life in the arid region has always been hard, but now Marsabit hasn't seen rain for a whole year. Climate change is said to be partly responsible for that, and it's the children who are suffering.
There is a strong relationship between climate change and the malnutrition, and especially if already there's been malnutrition, then it escalates by increasing the numbers and also the severity.
The frequency and severity of droughts in this region is expected to get worse due to climate change. A disaster for local pastoralists. Their livelihoods depend entirely on their animals. This camel herder tells us he's been looking for water for his camels for 2 days now, in vain. And these women often have to wait a whole day just to get water. Now there's less water flowing out of the tap. And that's a day they cannot spend searching for food. That is, when food is available at all. Selina Musa has hardly anything to feed her son.
It's painful, but I have to accept it. I can't feed him properly to give him what he needs to grow.
The young mother hopes the rains will finally return.
Now with me is the South African human rights and environmental activist Kumi Naidoo. Kumi started out as a child activist fighting apartheid in South Africa. Today, his activism is mostly focused on climate justice. He was the head of Greenpeace International until 2016. Welcome to DW News Africa, Kumi. We have just seen a report there from Kenya. This is a real and current example of how climate change is impacting lives in Africa. How bad will this situation get for people on the continent if the world does not reduce carbon emissions?
We have to recognize, firstly, that the decade that we find ourselves in right now is the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we'll have or whether we'll have a future at all. There is far too big a gap between what climate science is saying and what extreme weather events are saying on the one hand and what politics and economics are saying. It's important to recognize that the African continent has contributed minimally to the problem of climate change, but we are paying already the first and the most brutal price from the impacts of climate change. And we have seen disruptions in agricultural patterns. We've seen, as the science warned us, that we'll have fast or deep fluctuations between floods and drought. I mean, I grew up in Southern Africa. You know, I don't, in my entire memory, remember us having cyclones. But last year, you know, we had devastating cyclones in Mozambique, for example. So the impact already from climate is taking lives, destroying infrastructure, and reshaping the continent. So it's important that we recognize that if no urgent action is taken now, things will get much, much worse for people on the African continent.
Kumi, as we're reporting, world leaders will soon be gathering at the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. Let's have a listen now to some people in Africa telling us what they would like for world leaders to keep in mind.
As a farmer, I lost already some of my livestock because of the droughts. I hope that global leaders in COP26 come up with a positive solution for climate change that we here in Africa didn't even cause.
It's true that they create industries in order to manufacture things that are very good, but let them know how to create things that are good, that are going to dilute the gas that is released on the atmosphere, not to affect the human being existence. That's what I can propose.
We should be involved in helping to reduce carbon emissions because we are the inhabitants of this land, and we are dealing with a global threat.
They should consider us by forgiving our debts so that the money can be used from planting more trees for us to deal with the climate change.
OK, so some voices from the continent there. It's our understanding that African negotiators going into the COP26 summit will be asking for money to invest in measures to help Africa adapt to the climate change issues. So we're talking about money to plant trees, for example, like the lady in Malawi was just saying. Tell us more about these demands.
Firstly, it's important to note that it's not only African countries making the demand, it's countries in the global south more generally. And essentially, we're not asking for charity here. We're asking rich nations to pay their climate debt and as an act of redress because they've created the problem. And that's why, you know, it's not only a question of climate injustice. That's why we say it's a question of climate apartheid, that those parts of the world that contributed most to the problem were predominantly white, and those that are suffering most are predominantly people of color. And the rich nations of the world have failed that test with COVID, where they've not responded as they should. So the Green Climate Fund was an idea that was already agreed by COP that took place in Copenhagen in 2009, right?
Wow.
The money is not yet flowing.
That's right.
And what COP showed, that rich nations, what COVID showed, is rich nations can find money when they need, as you can see how much of money has been found to support their citizens. But what rich nations need to understand, just like with COVID, climate does not recognize boundaries. So the short-sightedness that rich nations have shown of COVID, we hope they eventually come around and understand that it's in their interest to support poor nations in terms of climate support.
You talked about these commitments being made as far back as 2009. How are we going to hold developed countries more accountable to pay up?
Well, with extreme difficulty is the short answer, because they can behave like with absolute impunity, as we've seen. Part of the solution is to ensure that we are making the citizens in rich countries aware of what is happening, and for them to recognize that it's in their self-interest to act. And I pay tribute here to movements like Fridays for the Future. The young people have been outstanding in terms of provoking the right kind of conversation and so on, as well as movements like Extinction Rebellion that have brought the issue of urgency to the table. So my faith at the moment is on ordinary people and making sure ordinary people in rich countries are able to convince their governments that they need to be more generous, not because it's an act of charity, but because it's in the self-interest of rich nations, because we either get this right as rich and poor countries are acting together, or true, poor countries are going to fall first and are suffering first, but ultimately the rich countries won't be protected from it, as floods in Germany and in Belgium a couple months ago showed that nobody is sort of immunized from the impacts of climate change.
All right. Thanks for that, Kumi. Thank you for the moment. Now, coal is the single biggest contributor to climate change. Burning coal, mainly to generate power, is responsible for nearly half of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. There are only some 27 coal-fired power stations in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a tiny amount compared to the rest of the world, but many fear a potential coal boom on the continent as African nations scramble to meet their power needs. Now, this dilemma is something South Africa is struggling with, as I found out on a recent visit. Right in the heart of the small town of Lephalale are two of the engines powering Africa's most industrialized economy. In the background is the ailing Matimba power station, which is 30 years old and nearing the end of its lifespan. And this is Medupi, the newest addition to the country's fleet of coal power plants. South Africa is one of the most electrified countries on the continent, but electricity shortages caused by aging and crumbling infrastructure have crippled the economy in the last decade. The new power station is crucial, but for some South Africans, Medupi has come at a high price.
You have to know that we live in one of the most beautiful areas in the world. This is the heart of the bushveld. And suddenly we've got a huge monstrosity built right in the center of this beautiful bushveld. There's power lines crisscrossing the countryside, there's noise pollution, light pollution, and of course air pollution, a lot of air pollution, which the community are suffering under.
And the impact goes beyond this small rural town. The two power stations are 10 kilometers apart, and between them is the mine that supplies them with coal. Right over here is the conveyor belt that transports coal from the mine, just behind me over there, to Medupi power station ahead of me and Matimba on my left. Now, it is the only mine in Lephalale, but this region is home to some of South Africa's most abundant coal reserves. In fact, underneath the ground I'm standing on, it's estimated there are billions of tons of coal here that could take South Africa to the latter part of the century. Coal has fueled the country's power for decades and remains the main energy source. Last year, 88% of South Africa's electricity was generated from coal. The state-owned company Eskom is the main supplier of the country's electricity.
We currently emit about 171 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere per annum. That accounts for roughly half of South Africa's emissions, and South Africa's emissions in turn account for half of the African continent's emissions. So Eskom is accountable for a quarter of the overall African emissions.
Studies show South Africa has great potential for wind and solar power generation. The country has been criticized for not transitioning to renewable energy fast enough.
But we don't intend to invest in any new coal-fired generation. So Medupi and Kusile will be the last coal-fired power stations that we build. As Eskom, we have committed to a net zero goal in terms of our carbon emissions by 2050. So we are already starting to work on plans to offset the emission from those two power stations to compensate by carbon negative projects.
While those plans are still being made, the country's coal power stations are churning out carbon emissions into the atmosphere, causing irreversible damage. Medupi is expected to do that for another 50 years. I'm now joined by Murefu Barasa. He is an energy sector expert based in Nairobi. Welcome to DW News Africa. A big question at COP26 is how countries can move away from fossil fuels. But how is this transition different in Africa compared to in developed nations?
If you think of a six-pack, just as a beer six-pack, developed countries have their cans full, the six-packs can full, and they have a mix of different technologies, solar, wind, hydro, and the developing countries have their six-packs empty. So they're trying to fill this six-pack with only renewable energy, and this is why the energy transition in developing countries is fundamentally different from that in developed countries. So you have a situation where the transition is from a situation where there's maximum energy production, universal energy access, and one where there's none.
Some wealthy countries are threatening to stop funding fossil fuel power projects in less developed countries. What would that mean for Africa?
Yeah, this is simply going to be detrimental to Africa's goal of attaining universal access to electricity by 2030. So just like I said, when we talk about renewable energy, we have to understand that there are different types of renewable energy. So on the one hand, you have what we call intermittent renewable energy like solar and wind. They're intermittent because wind does not blow all the time. Solar is available during the day and it's not available at night. And you have dispatchable or on-demand energy sources like hydro and geothermal. So many African countries do not have hydro and geothermal. So you cannot develop a robust electricity sector without a mix of these technologies. So if there is a moratorium on fossil fuels, then very many African countries are going to suffer severely because of this action.
You've written that Africa needs gas power and plants, gas power plants to provide electricity. Tell us a little bit more about why.
So if you're building a robust electricity sector, you cannot just build it based on solar and wind. And if we say that African countries have to develop just based on renewable energy, and many of these countries do not have hydro and geothermal, then what are you left with? You're left with gas as a transitional fuel source. And this is not unusual to Africa. Just this week, the German Chancellor in waiting, Olaf Scholz, was categorical that Germany will have to install new additional gas-fired plants if they're to transition to higher shares of renewable energy. So if Germany, that's very sophisticated, advanced, with all the technological know-how and the resources, has to build gas-powered plants, how much more poorer countries that are just developing their electricity sector?
All right, and that's where we'll leave it. Murefu Barasa is an energy sector expert in Nairobi. Thank you for your time and your insight. Now, talking of bringing power to the millions of Africans who are without, let's meet one farmer in eastern Rwanda who was tired of sitting in the dark. He brought electricity to his village and managed to make it climate-friendly at the same time.
Israel Hebimana was fed up living without electricity, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. He built a hydropower plant after selling 2 of his houses to buy used engines and water pipes in Kigali.
I never went to school. The idea for it came to me when I saw a small hydroelectric plant when I was a child. That's why, when I grew up, I wanted a similar plant, so we could generate electricity in my village.
The plant initially supplied more than 50 families in his village with electricity. But his first model failed to regulate the electricity supply, and the surges burned out people's electronics. Israel didn't give up. The plant was modernized and expanded with the help of the Rwanda Energy Group. It now gives power to 170 households. And hundreds of others are in the process of getting electricity. And light for the first time.
What a pleasure to have electricity. We're finally done with the darkness. Yes!
This schoolgirl is delighted she won't fall behind in her homework.
We had only one traditional lamp and didn't have enough fuel for everyone to use it at night. This stopped me from studying. Now I will be able to study longer. Even at night time, I can perform well at school.
Finally having electricity in the village is also good for business. It enabled this seamstress to double her output.
I used to use manual sewing machines, and that was really difficult. But after electricity came, I bought electric sewing machines straight away, and that's made my life much easier.
Many other opportunities have been created in this village since the arrival of electricity, thanks to Habimana and his hydroelectric plant.
Now, Kumi Naidu, the environmental activist, is still with me. So, Kumi, we've just seen a very good example there for one energy solution in a village in Rwanda. But if we consider the scale to which we need to electrify Africa, fossil fuels do have a record. Some voices on the continent say it's unfair to limit emissions on the world's poorest countries when emissions are rising in industrialized countries. What do you say to that?
Well, it's unfair, sure, but poor nations who are paying now the first and most brutal impacts of climate change cannot bury their heads in the sand and say, just because they did a bad thing in the rich countries, we also have a right to continue to do a bad thing. And let's just be clear, Africa is not a poor continent, right? Africa is the richest continent underneath the ground, and that's precisely why we're one of the poorest continents above the ground, what is called the resource curse. And let's be clear, that example from Rwanda is the example that should move us, because a lot of energy that's generated in big plants and then has to be transmitted long distances to get to the villages and so on gets lost in the process. And let's be very clear. Most of our governments on the continent know that we have huge solar potential, huge wind potential, huge wave potential, right? Because we're a continent, right, surrounded by, and on the argument that it's the sun blows, shines at some time and the wind blows at other time. That problem is being fixed by advances in battery storage capability. And I would say, and I challenge any African leader to tell me otherwise, right, that the reason most governments around the world are so committed to big fossil fuel projects at the moment is because the supply chain of corruption, right, is deeper, bigger, and juicier. I'm not saying that renewable energy is immune from corruption, right, but it is much less. Right. And so if we do not have a decentralized approach, right, rural areas throughout our continent, we can turn it around very quickly with small micro solar grids, with the kind of example that we saw with micro hydro and so on. So I don't buy the argument that many of our governments make that we have to do the dirty stuff, even though the dirty stuff is killing us right now. And the unfairness of it is recognized, right? And that's why we push so hard to have this 100 billion a year in the Green Climate Fund to help poor countries.
I have 10 seconds left on the clock. What commitment do you want to see from Africa's leaders going into the summit?
We want them to say, we will take climate change seriously. We will prioritize the poor in the way we allocate resources. We won't advantage industry at the expense of the people, and that they will put people before profit and before corruption.
All right, that's Kumi Naidu, the environmental activist. Thank you so much for that, Kumi.